Chapter 8, The Most Dangerous Job. One night I visit a slaughterhouse somewhere in the high plains. The slaughterhouse is one of the nation's largest. About 5,000 head of cattle enter it every day, single file, and leave in a different form. Someone who has access to the plant, who's upset by its working conditions, offers to give me a tour. The slaughterhouse is an immense building, gray and square, about 3 stories high, with no windows on the front and no architectural clues to what's happening inside. My friend gives me a chainmail apron and gloves, suggesting I try them on. Workers on the line wear about 8 pounds of chainmail beneath their white coats, shiny steel armor that covers their hands, wrists, stomachs, and back. The chainmail is designed to protect workers from cutting themselves and from being cut by other workers. But knives somehow manage to get past it. My host hands me some Wellingtons, the kind of knee-high rubber boots that English gentlemen wear in the countryside. Tuck your pants into the boots, he says. We'll be walking through some blood. I put on a hard hat and climb a stairway. The sounds get louder, factory sounds, the noise of power tools and machinery, bursts of compressed air. We start at the end of the line, the fabricating room. Workers call it fab. When we step inside, fab becomes familiar. Steel catwalks, pipes along the walls, a vast room, a maze of conveyor belts. This could be the Lamb Weston plant in Idaho, except hunks of red meat ride at the belts instead of French fries. Some machines assemble cardboard boxes. Others vacuum seal subprimals of beef in clear plastic. The workers look extremely busy, but there's nothing unsettling about this part of the plant. You see meat like this all the time in the back of your local supermarket. The fab room is cooled to about 40 degrees, and as you head up the line, the feel of the place starts to change. The pieces of meat get bigger. Workers, about half of them women, almost all of them young and Latino, slice meat in long, slender knives. They stand at a table that's chest high, grab meat off a conveyor belt, trim away fat, throw meat back on the belt, toss the scraps into a conveyor belt above them, and then grab more meat, all in a matter of seconds. I'm now struck by how many workers there are, hundreds of them, pressed close together, constantly moving, slicing. You see hard hats, white coats, flashes of steel. Nobody is smiling or chatting, they're too busy, anxiously trying not to fall behind. An old man walks past me, pushing a blue plastic barrel filled with scraps. A few workers carve the meat with wizards, small electric knives that have spinning round blades. The wizards look like the Norelco razors that Santa rides in on the TV ads. I notice that a few of the women near me are sweating, even though the place is freezing cold. Sides of beef suspended from an overhead trolley swing towards a group of men. Each worker has a large knife in one hand and a steel hook in the other. They grab the meat with their hooks and attack it fiercely with their knives. As they hack away, using all their strength, grunting, the place suddenly feels different, primordial. The machinery seems beside the point, and what's going on before me has been going on for thousands of years. The meat, the hook, the knife, men straining to cut more meat. On the kill floor, what I see no longer unfolds in a logical manner. It's one strange image after another. A worker with a power saw slices cattle into halves as though they were 2x4s, and then the halves swing by me into the cooler. It feels like a slaughterhouse now. Dozens of cattle, stripped of their skins, dangle on chains from their hind legs. My host stops and asks how I feel, if I want to go any further. This is where some people get sick. I feel fine, determined to see the whole process, the world that's been deliberately hidden. The kill floor is hot and humid. It stinks of manure. Cattle have a body temperature of about 110 degrees, and there are a lot of them in this room. Carcasses swing so fast along the rail that you have to keep an eye on them constantly, dodge them, watch your step, or one will slam you and throw you into the bloody concrete floor. It happens to workers all the time. I see. A man reach inside cattle and pull out their kidneys with his bare hands, then drop the kidneys down a metal chute over and over again as each animal passes by him. A stainless steel rack of tongues. Wizards peeling meat off decapitated heads, picking them almost as clean as the white skulls painted by Georgia O'Keeffe. We wade through blood that's ankle deep and that pours down drains into huge vats below us. As we approach the start of the line, for the first time I hear the steady pop, pop, pop of live animals being stunned. Now the cattle suspended above me look just like the cattle I've seen on ranches for years, but these ones are upside down swinging on hooks. For a moment, the sight seems unreal. There are so many of them, a herd of them, lifeless. And then I see a few hind legs still kicking, a final reflex action, and the reality comes hard and clear. For 8.5 hours, a worker called a sticker does nothing but stand in a river of blood, being drenched in blood, slitting the neck of a steer every 10 seconds or so, severing its carotid artery. He uses a long knife and must hit exactly the right spot to kill the animal humanely. He hits the spot again and again. We walk up a slippery metal stairway and reach a small platform where the production line begins. A man turns and smiles at me. He wears safety goggles and a hard hat. His face is splattered with gray matter and blood. He is the knocker, the man who welcomes cattle into the building. Cattle walk down a narrow chute and pause in front of him, blocked by a gate, and then he shoots them in the head with the captive bolt stunner, a compressed air gun attached to the ceiling by a long hose, which fires a steel bolt that knocks the cattle unconscious. The animals keep strolling up, oblivious to what comes next, and he stands over them and shoots. For 8.5 hours, he just shoots. As I stand there, he misses a few times and shoots the same animal twice. As soon as the steer falls, a worker grabs one of its hind legs, shackles it to a chain, and then the chain lifts the huge animal into the air. I watch the knocker knock cattle for a couple of minutes. The animals are powerful and imposing one moment and then gone in an instant, suspended from a rail ready for carving. A steer slips from the chain, falls to the ground, and gets its head caught in one end of a conveyor belt. The production line stops as workers struggle to free the steer, stunned but alive, from the machinery. I've seen enough. I step out of the building into the cool night air and follow the path that leads cattle into the slaughterhouse. They pass me, driven towards the building by workers with long white sticks that seem to glow in the dark. One steer, perhaps sensing instinctively what the others don't, turns and tries to run, but workers drive him back to join the rest. The cattle lazily walk single file towards the muffled sounds, pop, 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 coming from the open door. The path has hairpin turns that prevent cattle from seeing what's in store and keep them relaxed. As the ramp gently slopes upward, the animals may think they're headed for another truck, another road trip, and they are in unexpected ways. The ramp widens as it reaches ground level and then leads to a large cattle pen with wooden fences, a corral that belongs in a meadow, not here. As I walk along the fence, a group of cattle approach me, looking me straight in the eye like dogs hoping for a treat, and follow me out of some mysterious impulse. I stop and try to absorb the whole scene. The cool breeze, the cattle and their gentle lowing, a cloudless night, steam rising from the plant in the moonlight. And then I notice that the building does have one window, a small square of light on the second floor. It offers a glimpse of what's hidden behind the huge black facade. Through the little window, you can see bright red carcasses on hooks going round and round. Sharp knives. Knocker, sticker, shackler, rumper. First legger, knuckle dropper, navel boner, splitter, top, bottom butt, feed, kill chain. The names of job assignments at a modern slaughterhouse convey some of the brutality inherent in the work. Meatpacking is now the most dangerous job in the United States. The injury rate in a slaughterhouse is about 3 times higher than the rate in a typical American factory. Every year, about 1 out of 3 meatpacker workers in the country, roughly 43,000 men and women, suffer an injury or a work-related illness that requires medical attention beyond first aid. There is strong evidence that these numbers, compiled by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, underestimate the number of meatpacking injuries that occur. Thousands of additional injuries and illnesses most likely go unrecorded. Despite the use of conveyor belts, forklifts, dehydrating machines, and a variety of power tools, most of the work in the nation's slaughterhouses is still performed by hand. Poultry plants can be largely mechanized thanks to the breeding of chickens and are uniform in size. The birds in some Tyson factories are killed, plucked, gutted, beheaded, and sliced into cutlets by robots and machines. But cattle still come in all sizes and shapes, varying in weight by hundreds of pounds. The lack of a standardized steer has hindered the mechanization of beef plants. In one crucial respect, meatpacking work has changed little in the past 100 years. At the dawn of the 21st century, amid an era of extraordinary technological advance, the most important tool in a modern slaughterhouse is a sharp knife. Lacerations are the most common injuries suffered by meatpackers, who often stab themselves or stab someone working nearby. Tendinitis and cumulative trauma disorders are also quite common. Meatpacking workers routinely develop back problems, shoulder problems, carpal tunnel syndrome, and trigger finger, a syndrome in which a finger becomes frozen in a curled position. Indeed, the rate of these cumulative trauma injuries in the meatpacking industry is far higher than the rate in any other American industry. It is almost 35 times higher than the national average in industry. Many slaughterhouse workers make a knife cut every 2 or 3 seconds, which adds up to about 10,000 cuts during an 8-hour shift. If the knife has become dull, additional pressure is placed on the worker's tendons, joints, and nerves. A dull knife can cause pain to extend from the cutting hand all the way down the spine. Workers often bring their knives home and spend at least 40 minutes a day keeping the edges smooth, sharp, and sanded with no pits. One IBP worker, a small Guatemalan woman with graying hair, spoke with me in the cramped kitchen of her mobile home. As a pot of beans cooked on the stove, she sat in a wooden chair gently rocking, telling the story of her life, of her journey north in search of work, the whole time sharpening big knives in her lap as though she were knitting a sweater. The IBP revolution has been directly responsible for many of the hazards that meatpacking workers now face. One of the leading determinants of the injury rate at a slaughterhouse today is the speed of the assembly line. The faster it runs, the more likely the workers will get hurt. The old meatpacking plants in Chicago slaughtered about 50 cattle an hour. 20 years ago, new plants in the High Plains slaughtered about 175 cattle an hour. Today, some plants slaughter up to 400 cattle an hour, about half a dozen animals every minute, sent down a single production line carved by workers desperate not to fall behind. While trying to keep up with the flow of meat, workers often neglect to resharpen their knives and thereby place more stress on their bodies. As the pace increases, so does the risk of accidental cuts and stabbings. I could always tell the line speed, a former Montfort nurse told me, by the number of people with lacerations coming into my office. People usually cut themselves. Nevertheless, everyone on the line tries to stay alert. Meat packers often work within inches of each other, wielding large knives. A simple mistake can cause a serious injury. A former IBP worker told me about boning knives suddenly flying out of hands and ricocheting off of machinery. They're very flexible, she said, and they'll spring on you, zwing, and they're gone. Much like French fry factories, beef slaughterhouses often operate at profit margins as low as a few pennies a pound. The 3 meat packing giants, ConAgra, IBP, and Excel, try to increase their earnings by maximizing the volume of production at each plant. Once a slaughterhouse is up and running, fully staffed, the profits it will earn are directly related to the speed of the line. A faster pace means higher profits. Market pressures now exert a perverse influence on the management of beef plants. The same factors that make these slaughterhouses relatively inefficient, the lack of mechanization, the reliance on human labor, encourage companies to make them even more dangerous by speeding up the pace. The unrelenting pressure of trying to keep up with the line has encouraged widespread methamphetamine use among meat packers. Workers taking crank feel charged and self-confident, ready for anything. Supervisors have been known to sell crank to their workers or to supply it for free in return for certain favors such as working a second shift. Workers who use methamphetamine may feel energized and invincible, but are actually putting themselves at much greater risk of having an accident. For obvious reasons, a modern slaughterhouse is not a safe place to be high. In the days when labor unions were strong, workers could complain about excessive line speeds and injury rates without fear of getting fired. Today, only 1/3 of IBP's workers belong to a union. Most of the non-union workers are recent immigrants. Many are illegals, and they are generally employed at will. That means they can be fired without warning for just about any reason. Such as arrangement does not encourage them to lodge complaints. Workers who have traveled a great distance for this job, who have families to support, who are earning 10 times more an hour in a meatpacking plant than they could possibly earn back home, are wary about speaking out and losing everything. The line speeds the labor cost at IBP's non-union plants now set the standard for the rest of the industry. Every other company must try to produce beef as quickly and cheaply as IBP does. Slowing the pace to protect workers can lead to a competitive disadvantage. Again and again, workers told me that they are under tremendous pressure not to report injuries. The annual bonuses of plant foremen and supervisors are often based in part on the injury rate of their workers. Instead of creating a safer workplace, these bonus schemes encourage slaughterhouse managers to make sure that accidents and injuries go unreported. Missing fingers, broken bones, deep lacerations, and amputated limbs are difficult to conceal from authorities, but the dramatic and catastrophic injuries in a slaughterhouse are greatly outnumbered by less visible, though no less debilitating ailments: torn muscles, slipped discs, and pinched nerves. If a worker agrees not to report an injury, a supervisor will usually shift him or her to an easier job for a while, providing some time to heal. If the injury seems more serious, a Mexican worker is often given the opportunity to return home for a while to recuperate there, then come back to his or her slaughterhouse job in the United States. Workers who abide by these unwritten rules are treated respectfully. Those who disobey are likely to be punished and made an example. As one former IBP worker explained, they're trying to deter you, period, from going to the doctor. From a purely economic point of view, injured workers are a drag on profits. They are less productive. Getting rid of them makes a good deal of financial sense, especially when new workers are readily available and inexpensive to train. Injured workers are often given some of the most unpleasant tasks in the slaughterhouse. Their hourly wages are cut, and through a wide variety of unsubtle means, they are encouraged to quit. Not all supervisors in a slaughterhouse behave like Simon Legree, shouting at workers, cursing them, belittling their injuries, always pushing them to move faster. But enough supervisors act that way to warrant the comparison. Production supervisors tend to be men in their late 20s and early 30s. Most are Anglos and don't speak Spanish, although more and more Latinos are being promoted to the job. They earn about $30,000 a year plus bonuses and benefits. In many rural communities, being a supervisor at a meatpacking plant is one of the best jobs in town. It comes with a fair amount of pressure, A supervisor must meet production goals, keep the number of recorded injuries low, and most importantly, keep the meat flowing down the line without interruption. The job also brings enormous power. Each supervisor is like a dictator in his or her section of the plant, largely free to boss, fire, berate, and reassign workers. That sort of power can lead to all sorts of abuses, especially when the hourly workers being supervisors are women. Many women told me stories about being fondled and grabbed on the production line, and the behavior of supervisors sets the tone for other male workers. In February of 1999, a federal jury in Des Moines awarded $2.4 million to a female employee at an IBP slaughterhouse. According to the woman's testimony, coworkers had screamed obscenities and rubbed their bodies against hers while supervisors laughed. 7 months later, Montfort agreed to settle a lawsuit filed by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on behalf of 14 female workers in Texas. As part of the settlement, the company paid the women $900,000 and vowed to establish formal proceedings for handling sexual harassment complaints. In their lawsuit, the women alleged that supervisors at a Montfort plant in Cactus, Texas, pressured them for dates and sex, and that male coworkers groped them, kissed them, and used animal parts in a sexually explicit manner. The sexual relationships between supervisors and hourlies are for the most part consensual. Most female workers optimistically regard sex with their supervisor as a way to gain a secure place in American society, a green card, a husband, or at the very least, a transfer to an easier job at the plant. Some supervisors become meatpacking Casanovas, engaging in multiple affairs. Sex, drugs, and slaughterhouses may seem an unlikely combination, but as one former Montfort employee told me, inside those walls is a different world that obeys different laws. Late on the second shift, when it's dark outside, assignations take place in locker rooms, staff rooms, and parked cars, even on the catwalk over the kill floor. The worst. Some of the most dangerous jobs in meatpacking today are performed by the late-night cleaning crews. A large proportion of these workers are illegal immigrants. They are considered independent contractors employed not by the meatpacking firms, but by sanitation companies. They earn hourly wages that are about 1/3 lower than those of regular production employees. And their work is so hard and so horrendous that words seem inadequate to describe it. The men and women who now clean the nation's slaughterhouses may arguably have the worst job in the United States. It takes a really dedicated person, a former member of a cleaning crew told me, or a really desperate person to get the job done. When a sanitation crew arrives at a meatpacking plant, usually around midnight, it faces a mess of monumental proportions. 3,000 to 4,000 cattle, each weighing about 1,000 pounds, have been slaughtered there that day. The place has to be cleaned by sunrise. Some of the workers wear water-resistant clothing, most don't. The principal cleaning tool is a high-pressure hose that shoots a mixture of water and chlorine heated to about 180 degrees. As the water is sprayed, the plant fills with a thick, heavy fog. Visibility drops to as little as 5 feet. The conveyor belts and machinery are running. Workers stand on the belts, spraying them, riding them like moving sidewalks as high as 15 feet off the ground. Workers climb ladders with hoses and spray the catwalks. They get under tables and conveyor belts, climbing right into the bloody muck, cleaning out grease, fat, manure, leftover scraps of meat. Glasses and safety goggles fog up. The inside of the plant heats up, temperatures soon exceed 100 degrees. It's hot and it's foggy, and you can't see anything, a former sanitation worker said. The crew members can't see or hear each other when the machinery's running. They routinely spray each other with burning hot chemical-laden water. They are sickened by the fumes. Jesus, a soft-spoken employee of DCS Sanitation Management Incorporated, the company that IBP uses in many of its plants, told me that every night on the job, he gets terrible headaches. You feel it in your head, he said. You feel it in your stomach like you want to throw up. A friend of his vomits whenever they clean the rendering area. Others workers tease the young man as he retches. Jesus says the stench rendering is so powerful that it won't wash off no matter how much soap you use after a shift. The smell comes home with you, seeps from your pores. One night while Jesus was cleaning, a coworker forgot to turn off a machine, lost 2 fingers, and went into shock. An ambulance came and took him away, as everyone else continued to clean. He was back at work the following week. If one hand is no good, the supervisor told him, use the other. Another sanitation worker lost an arm in a machine. Now he folds towels in the locker room. The scariest job, according to Jesus, is cleaning the vents on the floor of the slaughterhouse. The vents become clogged with grease and dried blood. In the winter, when everything gets icy and the wind picks up, Jesus worries that a sudden gust will blow him off the roof into the darkness. Although official statistics are not kept, the death rate among slaughterhouse sanitation crews is extraordinarily high. They are the ultimate in disposable workers, illegal, illiterate, impoverished, untrained. The nation's worst job can end in just about the worst way. Sometimes these workers are literally ground up and reduced to nothing. A brief description of some cleaning crew accidents over the past decade says more about the work and the danger than any set of statistics. At the Montfort plant in Grand Island, Nebraska, Richard Scala was beheaded by a dehiding machine. Carlos Vincent, an employee of T&N Green Service Company, a 28-year-old Guatemalan who'd been in the United States for only a week, was pulled into the cogs of a conveyor belt at an Excel plant in Montfort, Colorado, and torn apart. Lorenzo Martin Sr., an employee of DCS Sanitation, fell from the top of a skinning machine while cleaning it with a high-pressure hose, struck his head on the concrete floor of an IBP plant in Columbus Junction, Iowa, and died. Another employee of DCS Sanitation, Salvador Hernandez Gonzalez, had his head crushed by a pork loin processing machine at an IBP plant in Madison, Nebraska. The same machine had fatally crushed the head of another worker, Ben Barone, a few years earlier. At a national beef plant in Liberal, Kansas, Homer Stoll climbed into a blood collection tank to clean it, a filthy tank 30 feet high. Stoll was overcome by hydrogen sulfide fumes. 2 coworkers climbed into the tank and tried to rescue him. All 3 men died. 8 years earlier, Henry Wolfe had been overcome by hydrogen sulfide fumes while cleaning the very same tank. Gary Sanders had tried to rescue him. Both men died. And the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, later fined National Beef for its negligence. The fine was $480 for each man's death. Don't get caught. During the same years, when the working conditions in America's meatpacking plants became more dangerous, when line speeds increased and illegal immigrants replaced skilled workers, the federal government greatly reduced the enforcement of health and safety laws. OSHA had long been despised by the nation's manufacturers, who considered the agency a source of meddlesome regulations and unnecessary red tape. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, OSHA was already underfunded and understaffed. Its 1,300 inspectors were responsible for a safety of more than 5 million workers across the country. A typical American employee could expect an OSHA inspection once every 80 years. Nevertheless, the Reagan administration was determined to reduce OSHA's authority even further as part of the push for deregulation. The number of OSHA inspectors was eventually cut by 20%, and in 1981, the agency adopted a new policy of voluntary compliance. Instead of arriving unannounced at a factory and performing an inspection, OSHA employees were required to look at the company's injury log before setting foot inside the plant. If the records showed an injury rate at the factory lower than the national average for all manufacturers, the OSHA inspector had to turn around and leave at once, without entering the plant, examining the equipment, or talking to any of the workers. These injury logs were kept and maintained by company officials. For most of the 1980s, OSHA's relationship with the meatpacking industry was far from adversarial. While the number of serious injuries rose, the number of OSHA inspections fell. The number of workers on the job was punished. The death of a worker on the job was punished with a fine of just a few $100s. At a gathering of meat company executives in October of 1987, OSHA's safety director, Barry White, promised to change federal safety standards that appeared amazingly stupid to you, or overburdening, or just not useful. According to an account of the meeting later published in the Chicago Tribune, the safety director of OSHA, the federal official most responsible for protecting the lives of meatpacking workers, acknowledged his own lack of qualification for the job. I know very well that you know more about safety and health in the meat industry than I do, White told the executives, and you know more about safety and health in the meat industry than any single employee at OSHA. OSHA's voluntary compliance policy did indeed reduce the number of recorded injuries in meatpacking plants. It did not, however, reduce the number of people getting hurt. It merely encouraged companies, in the words of a subsequent Congressional investigation, to understate injuries, to falsify records, and to cover up accidents. At the IBP beef plant in Dakota City, Nebraska, for example, the company kept two sets of injury logs, one of them recording every injury and illness at the slaughterhouse, the other provided to visiting OSHA inspectors and researchers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. During a 3-month period in 1985, the first log recorded 1,800 injuries and illnesses at the plant. The OSHA log recorded only 160, a discrepancy of more than 1,000%. At congressional hearings on meatpacking in 1987, Robert L. Peterson, the chief executive of IBP, denied under oath that two sets of logs were ever kept and called IBP's safety record the best of the best. Congressional investigators later got hold of both logs and found that the injury rate at its Dakota City plant was as much as 1/3 higher than the average rate in the meatpacking industry. Congressional investigators also discovered that IBP had altered injury records at its beef plant in Emporia, Kansas. Another leading meatpacking company, John Morrell, was caught lying about injuries at its plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The congressional investigation concluded that these companies had failed to report serious injuries such as fractures, concussions, major cuts, hernias, some requiring hospitalization, surgery, even amputation. Congressman Tom Lantos, whose subcommittee conducted the meatpacking inquiry, called IBP one of the most irresponsible and reckless corporations in America. A Labor Department official called the company's behavior the worst example of underreporting injuries and illnesses to workers ever encountered in OSHA's 16-year history. Nevertheless, Robert L. Peterson was never charged with perjury for his misleading testimony before Congress. Investigators argued that it would be difficult to prove conclusively that Peterson had willfully lied. In 1987, IBP was fined $2.6 million by OSHA for underreporting injuries and later fined an additional $3.1 million for the high rate of cumulative trauma injuries at the Dakota City plant. After the company introduced a new safety program there, the fines were reduced to $975,000. a sum that might have appeared large at the time, yet represented about 1/100th% of IBP's annual revenues. 3 years after the OSHA fines, a worker named Kevin Wilson injured his back at an IBP slaughterhouse in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Wilson went to see Diane Arndt, a nurse at the plant, who sent him to a doctor selected by the company. Wilson's injury was not serious, the doctor said, later assigning him to light duty at the plant. Wilson sought a second opinion. The new doctor said that he had a disc injury that required a period of absence from work. When Wilson stopped reporting for light duty, IBP's corporate security department began to conduct surveillance of his house. 11 days after Wilson's new doctor told IBP that back surgery might be required, Diane Arndt called the doctor and said that IBP had obtained a videotape of Wilson engaging in strenuous physical activities at home. The doctor felt deceived, met with Wilson, accused him of being a liar, refused to provide him with any more treatment, and told him to get back to work. Convinced that no such videotape existed and that IBP had fabricated the entire story in order to deny him medical treatment, Kevin Wilson sued the company for slander. The lawsuit eventually reached the Iowa Supreme Court. In a decision that received little media attention, the Supreme Court upheld a lower court's award of $2 million to Wilson and described some of IBP's unethical practices. The court found that seriously injured workers were required to show up at the IBP plant briefly each day so that the company could avoid reporting lost workdays to OSHA. Some workers were compelled to show up for work on the same day as a surgery or the day after an amputation. IBP's management was aware of and participated in this practice, the Iowa Supreme Court noted. IBP nurses regularly entered false information into the plant's computer system, reclassifying injuries so that they didn't have to be reported to OSHA. Injured workers who proved uncooperative were assigned to jobs watching gauges in the rendering plant, where they were subjected to an atrocious smell while hog remains were boiled down into fertilizer and blood was drained into tanks. According to evidence introduced to court, Diane Arndt had a low opinion of the workers whose injuries she was supposed to be treating. The IBP nurse called them idiots and jerks, telling doctors that this guy's a crybaby and this guy's full of shit. She later admitted that Wilson's back injuries was legitimate. The Iowa Supreme Court concluded that the lies she told in the medical case, as well as in others, had been partly motivated by IBP's financial incentive program, which gave staff members bonuses and prizes when the number of lost workdays was kept low. The program, in the court's opinion, was somewhat disingenuously called the Safety Award System. IBP's attitude towards worker safety was hardly unique in the industry, according to Edward Murphy's testimony before Congress in 1992. Murphy had served as a safety director at the Montfort beef plant in Grand Island. After 2 workers were killed there in 1991, Montfort fired him. Murphy claimed that he had battled the company for years over safety issues and that Montfort had unfairly made him the scapegoat for its own illegal behavior. The company later paid him an undisclosed sum of money to settle a civil lawsuit over wrongful termination. Murphy told Congress that during his tenure at the Grand Island plant, Montfort maintained 2 sets of injury logs, routinely lied to OSHA, and shredded documents requested by OSHA. He wanted Congress to know that the safety lapses at the plant were not accidental. They stem directly from Montfort's corporate philosophy, which Murphy describes in these terms. The first commandment is that only production counts. The employee's duty is to follow orders, period. As I was repeatedly told, do what I tell you, even if it is illegal, don't get caught. A lawsuit filed in May of 1998 suggests that little has changed since IBP was caught keeping 2 sets of injury logs more than a decade ago. Michael G. Farrell, a former vice president at IBP, contends that the real blame for the high injury rate at the company lies not with the workers, supervisors, nurses, safety directors, or plant managers, but with IBP's top executives. Farrell had ample opportunity to observe their decision-making process. Among other duties, he was in charge of the health and safety programs at IBP. When Farrell accepted the job in 1991 after many years as an industrial engineer at other firms, he believed that IBP's desire to improve worker safety was sincere. According to his legal complaint, Farrell later discovered that IBP's safety records were routinely falsified and that the company cared more about production than anything else. Farrell was fired by IBP in 1997, not long after a series of safety problems at a slaughterhouse in Palestine, Texas. The circumstances surrounding his firing are at the heart of the lawsuit. On December 4, 1996, an OSHA inspection of the Palestine plant found a number of serious violations and imposed a fine of $35,125. Less than a week later, a worker named Clarence Dupree lost an arm in a bone-crushing machine. And 2 days after that, another worker, Willie Morris, was killed by an ammonia gas explosion. Morris's body lay on the floor for hours, just 10 feet from the door, as toxic gas filled the building. Nobody at the plant had been trained to use hazardous materials, gas masks, or protective suits. The equipment sat in a locked storage room. Farrell flew to Texas and toured the plant after the incidents. He thought the facility was in terrible shape, with a cooling system that violated OSHA standards, faulty wiring that threatened to cause a mass electrocution, and safety mechanisms that had deliberately been disabled with magnets. He wanted the slaughterhouse to be shut down immediately, and it was. 2 months later, Farrell lost his job. In his lawsuit seeking payment for wrongful termination, Farrell contends that he was fired for giving the order to close the Palestine plant. He claims that IBP had never before shut down a slaughterhouse purely for safety reasons, and that Robert L. Peterson was enraged by the decision. IBP disputes the version of events, contending that Farrell had never fit into IBP's corporate culture, that he delegated too much authority, and that he had not, in fact, made the decision to shut down the Palestine plant. According to IBP, the decision to shut it down was made after a unanimous vote by its top executives. IBP's Palestine slaughterhouse reopened in January of 1997. It was shut down again a year later, this time by the USDA. Federal inspectors cited the plant for inhumane slaughter and halted production there for 1 week, an extremely rare penalty imposed for the mistreatment of cattle. In 1999, IBP closed the plant. As of this writing, it sits empty, awaiting a buyer. The value of an arm. When I first visited Greeley in 1997, Javier Ramirez was president of the UFCW Local 990, the union representing employees at the Montfort beef plant. The Labor Union Relations Board had ruled that Montfort committed numerous pervasive and outrageous violations of labor law after reopening the Greeley beef plant in 1982. Violations of labor law, discriminating against former union members at hiring time, and intimidating new workers during a union election. Former employees who'd been treated unfairly ultimately received a $10.6 million settlement. After a long and arduous organizing drive, workers at the Montfort beef plant voted to join the UFCW in 1992. Javier Ramirez is 31 and knows a fair amount about beef. His father is Ruben Ramirez, the Chicago union leader. Javier grew up around slaughterhouses and watched the meatpacking industry abandon his hometown for the High Plains. Instead of finding another line of work, he followed the industry to Colorado, trying to gain better wages and working conditions for the mainly Latino workforce. The UFCW has given workers in Greeley the ability to challenge unfair dismissals, file grievances against supervisors, and report safety lapses without fear of reprisal. But the union's power is limited by the plant's high turnover rate. Every year, a new set of workers must be persuaded to support the UFCW. The plant's revolving door is not conducive conducive to workers' solidarity. At the moment, some of the most pressing issues for the UFCW are regulated to the high injury rate at the slaughterhouse. It is a constant struggle not only to prevent workers from getting hurt, but also to gain them proper medical treatment and benefits once they've been hurt. Colorado was one of the first states to pass a workers' compensation law. The idea behind the legislation enacted in 1919 was to provide speedy medical care and a steady income to workers injured on the job. Workers' comp was meant to function much like no-fault insurance. In return for surrendering the right to sue employees for injuries, workers were supposed to receive immediate benefits. Similar workers' comp plans were adopted throughout the United States. In 1991, Colorado started another trend, becoming one of the first states to impose harsh restrictions on workers' comp payments. In addition to reducing the benefits afforded to injured employees, Colorado's new law granted employers the right to choose the physician who determined the severity of any work-related ailment. Enormous power over workers' comp claims was handed to company doctors. Many other states subsequently followed Colorado's lead and cut back their workers' comp benefits. The Colorado bill, promoted as workers' comp reform, was first introduced in the legislature by Tom Norton, the president of the Colorado State Senate and a conservative Republican. Norton represented Greeley, where his wife, Kay, was the vice president of legal and governmental affairs at ConAgra Red Meat. In most businesses, a high injury rate would promote insurance companies to demand changes in the workplace. But ConAgra, IBP, and the other large meatpacking firms are self-insured. They are under no pressure from independent underwriters and have a strong incentive to keep workers' comp payments to a bare minimum. Every penny spent on workers' comp is one less penny of corporate revenue. Javier Ramirez began to educate Montfort workers about their legal right to get workers' comp benefits after an injury at the plant. Many workers don't realize that such insurance even exists. The workers' comp claim forms look intimidating, especially to people who don't speak any English and can't read any language. Filing a claim, challenging a powerful meatpacking company, and placing faith in the American legal system requires a good deal of courage, especially for a recent immigrant. When a workers' comp claim involves an injury that is nearly impossible to refute, such as an on-the-job amputation, the meatpacking companies generally agree to pay. But when injuries are less visible, such as those stemming from cumulative trauma, the meatpackers often prolong the whole workers' comp process through litigation, insisting upon hearings and filing seemingly endless appeals. Some of the most painful and debilitating injuries are the hardest to prove. Today, it can take years for an injured worker to receive workers' comp benefits. During that time, he or she may pay medical bills and find a source of income. Many rely on public assistance. The ability of meatpacking firms to delay payment discourages many injured workers from ever filing workers' comp claims. It leads others to accept a reduced sum of money as part of a negotiated settlement in order to cover medical bills. The system now leaves countless unskilled and uneducated manual workers poorly compensated for injuries that will forever hamper their ability to earn a living. The few who win in court and receive full benefits are hardly set for life. Under Colorado's new law, the payment for losing an arm is $36,000. An amputated finger gets anywhere from $2,200 to $4,500, depending on which one is lost. And serious permanent disfigurement above the head, face, or parts of the body normally exposed to public view entitles you to a maximum of $2,000. As workers' comp benefits have become more difficult to obtain, the threat to workplace safety has grown more serious. During the first 2 years of the Clinton administration, OSHA seemed like a revitalized agency. It began to draw up the first ergonomic standards for the nation's manufacturers, aiming to reduce cumulative trauma disorders. The election of 1994, however, marked a turning point. The Republican majority in Congress that rose to power that year not only impeded the adoption of ergonomic standards, but also raised questions about the future of OSHA. Working closely with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, House Republicans have worked hard to limit OSHA's authority. Congressman Cass Ballinger, a Republican from North Carolina, introduced legislation that would require OSHA to spend at least half of its budget on consultations with businesses instead of enforcement. The new budget requirement would further reduce the number of OSHA inspections, which by the late 1990s had already reached an all-time low. Ballinger has long opposed OSHA inspections, despite the fact that near his own district, a fire at a poultry plant killed 25 workers in 1991. The plant had never been inspected by OSHA. Its emergency exits had been chained shut, and the bodies of workers were found in piles near the locked doors. Congressman Joel Heffley, a Colorado Republican whose district includes Colorado Springs, has introduced a bill that makes Ballinger seem moderate. Heffley's OSHA Reform Act would essentially repeal the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. It would forbid OSHA from conducting any workplace inspections or imposing any fines. Kenny. During my trips to meatpacking towns in the High Plains, I met dozens of workers who'd been injured. Each of their stories was different, yet somehow familiar, linked by common elements. The same struggle to receive proper medical care, the same fear of speaking out, the same underlying corporate indifference. We are human beings, more than one person told me, but they treat us like animals. The workers I met wanted their stories to be told. They wanted people to know about what is happening right now. A young woman who'd injured her back and her right hand at the Greeley plant said to me, "I want to go on top of the rooftop and scream my lungs out so that somebody will hear." The voices and faces of these workers are indelibly with me, as is the sight of their hands, the light brown skin crisscrossed with white scars. Although I cannot tell of their stories, a few need to be mentioned. Like all lives, they can be used as examples or serve as representative types. But ultimately, they are unique, individual, impossible to define or replace. The opposite of how this system has treated them. Raul was born in Zapoteca, Mexico, and did construction work in Anaheim before moving to Colorado. He speaks no English. After hearing a Montfort ad on a Spanish-language radio station, he applied for a job at the Greeley plant. One day, Raul reached into a processing machine to remove a piece of meat. The machine accidentally went on. Raul's arm got stuck, and it took workers 20 minutes to get it out. The machine had to be taken apart. An ambulance brought Raul to the hospital, where a deep gash in the shoulder was sewn shut. A tendon had been severed. After getting stitches and a strong prescription painkiller, he was driven back to the slaughterhouse and put back on the production line. Bandaged, groggy, and in pain, one arm tied in a sling, Raul spent the rest of the day wiping blood off cardboard boxes with his good hand. Ronaldo was another Montfort worker who spoke no English, an older man with graying hair. He developed carpal tunnel syndrome while cutting meat. The injury got so bad that sharp pain shot from his hand all the way up his shoulder. At night it hurt so much he could not fall asleep in bed. Instead, he would fall asleep sitting in a chair beside the bed where his wife lay. For 3 years, he slept in that chair every night. Kenny Dobbins was a Montfort employee for almost 16 years. He was born in Keokuk, Iowa, had a tough childhood and an abusive stepfather, left home at the age of 13, went in and out of various schools, never learned to read, did various odd jobs, and wound up at the Montfort Slaughterhouse in Grand Island, Nebraska. He started working there in 1979, right after the company bought it from Swift. He was 23. He worked in the shipping department at first, hauling boxes that weighed as much as 120 pounds. Kenny could handle it, though. He was a big man, muscular, and 6'5", and nothing in his life had ever been easy. One day, Kenny heard someone yell, "Watch out!" then turned around and saw a 90-pound box falling from an upper level of the shipping department. Kenny caught the box with one arm, but the momentum threw him against a conveyor belt, and the metal teeth on the rim of the belt pierced his lower back. The company doctor bandaged Kenny's back and said the pain was just a pulled muscle. Kenny never filed for workers' comp, stayed home for a few days, then returned to work. He had a wife and 3 children to support. For the next few months, he was in terrible pain. It hurt so fucking bad you wouldn't believe it, he told me. He saw another doctor, got a second opinion. The new doctor said Kenny had a pain of severely herniated discs. He had a pair of severely herniated discs. Kenny had back surgery, spent a month in the hospital, got sent to a pain clinic when the operation didn't work. His marriage broke up amid the stress and financial difficulty. 14 months after the injury, Kenny returned to the slaughterhouse. Give up after back surgery? Not Kenny Dobbins, a Montfort newsletter proclaimed. Kenny had learned how to handle the rigors of working in a packing plant and is trying to help others do the same. Thanks, Ken, and keep up the good work. Kenny felt a strong loyalty to Montfort. He could not read, possessed few skills other than his strength, and the company had still given him a job. When Montfort decided to reopen its Greeley plant with a non-union workforce, Kenny volunteered to go there and help. He did not think highly of labor unions. His supervisors told him the unions had been responsible for shutting down meatpacking plants all over the country. When the UFCW tried to organize the Greeley slaughterhouse, Kenny became an active and outspoken member of an anti-union group. At the Grand Island facility, Kenny had been restricted to light duty after his injury, but his supervisor in Greeley said the old restrictions didn't apply to the new job. Soon, Kenny was doing tough physical labor once again, wielding a knife and grabbing 40 to 50-pound pieces of meat off a table. When the pain became unbearable, he was transferred to ground beef, then to rendering. According to a former manager at the Greeley plant, Montfort was trying to get rid of Kenny, trying to make his work so unpleasant that he'd quit. Kenny didn't realize it. He still believes in his heart that people are honest and good, the former manager said about Kenny. And he's wrong. As part of the job in rendering, Kenny sometimes had to climb into gigantic blood tanks and gut bins, reach to the bottom of them with his long arms, and unclog the drains. One day, he was unexpectedly called to work over the weekend. There had been a problem with salmonella contamination. The plant needed to be disinfected, and some of the maintenance workers had refused to do it. In his street clothes, Kenny began cleaning the place, climbing into tank and spraying a liquid chlorine mix. Chlorine is a hazardous chemical that can be inhaled or absorbed through the skin, causing a litany of health problems. Workers who spray it need to wear protective gloves, safety goggles, a self-contained respirator, and full coveralls. Kenny's supervisor gave him a paper dust mask to wear, but it quickly dissolved. After 8 hours of working with the chlorine in unventilated areas, Kenny went home and felt ill. He was rushed to the hospital and placed in an oxygen tent. His lungs had been burned by the chemicals. His body was covered in blisters. Kenny spent a month in the hospital. Kenny eventually recovered from the overexposure to chlorine, but it left his chest feeling raw, made him susceptible to colds and sensitive to chemical aromas. He went back to work at the Greeley plant. He had remarried, didn't know what other kind of work to do, still felt loyal to the company. He was assigned to an early morning shift. He had to drive an old truck from one part of the slaughterhouse complex to another. The truck was filled with leftover scraps of meat. The headlights and the wipers didn't work. The windshield was filthy and cracked. One cold, dark morning in the middle of winter, Kenny became disoriented while driving. He stopped the truck, opened the door, got out to see where he was, and was struck by a train. It knocked his glasses off, threw him up in the air, and knocked both of his work boots off. The train was moving slowly, or he would have been killed. Kenny somehow made it back to the plant, barefoot and bleeding from deep gashes in his back and his face. He spent 2 weeks at the hospital, then went back to work. One day, Kenny was in rendering and saw a worker about to stick his head into a pre-breaker machine, a device that uses hundreds of small hammers to pulverize gristle and bone into a fine powder. The The worker had just turned the machine off, but Kenny knew the hammers inside were still spinning. It takes 15 minutes for the machine to shut down completely. Kenny yelled, "Stop!" But the worker didn't hear him. And so Kenny ran across the room, grabbed the man by the seat of his pants, and pulled him away from the machine an instant before it would have pulverized him. To honor this act of bravery, Montfort gave Kenny an award for outstanding achievement and concern for fellow workers. The award was a paper certificate signed by his supervisor and the plant safety manager. Kenny later broke his leg, stepped into a hole in the slaughterhouse concrete floor. On another occasion, he shattered his ankle, an injury that required surgery and the insertion of 5 steel pins. Now Kenny had to wear a metal brace on one leg in order to walk, an elaborate spring-loaded brace that cost $2,000. Standing for long periods caused him great pain. He was given a job recycling old knives at the plant. Despite his many injuries, the job required him to climb up and down 3 flights of narrow stairs carrying garbage bags filled with knives. In December of 1995, Kenny felt a sharp pain in his chest while lifting some boxes. He thought it was a heart attack. His union steward took him to see the nurse, who said it was just a pulled muscle and sent Kenny home. He was indeed having a massive heart attack. A friend rushed Kenny to a nearby hospital. A stent was inserted in his heart, and the doctors told Kenny that he was lucky to be alive. Not long afterward, Montfort fired Kenny Dobbins. Despite the fact that Kenny had been with the company for almost 16 years, despite the fact that he was first in seniority at the Greeley plant, that he cleaned bloody tanks and with his bare hands fought the union, done whatever the company had asked him to do, suffered injuries that would have killed weaker men, nobody from Montfort called him with the news. Nobody even bothered to write him. Kenny learned that he'd been fired when his payments to the company health insurance plan kept being returned by the post office. He called Montfort repeatedly to find out what was going on, and a sympathetic clerk in the claims office finally told Kenny that the checks were being returned because he was no longer a Montfort employee. When I asked company spokesmen to comment on the accuracy of Kenny's story, they would neither confirm nor deny any of the details. Today, Kenny is in poor health. His heart is permanently damaged. His immune system seems shot. His back hurts, his ankle hurts, and every so often he coughs up blood. He is unable to work at any job. His wife, Clara, who's half Latina and half Cheyenne, and looks like a younger sister of Cher's, was working as a nursing home attendant when Kenny had his heart attack. Amid the stress of his illness, she developed a serious kidney ailment. She is unemployed and recuperating from a kidney transplant. As I sit in the living room of their Greeley home, its walls decorated with paintings of wolves, Denver Broncos memorabilia, an American flag, Kenny and Clara told me about their financial condition. After almost 16 years on the job, Kenny did not get any pension from Montfort. The company challenged his workers' comp claim and finally agreed, 3 years after the initial filing, to pay him a settlement of $35,000. 15% of that money went to Kenny's lawyer, and the rest is long gone. Some months, Kenny has to hawk things to get money for Clara's medicine. They have 2 teenage children and live on Social Security payments. Kenny's health insurance, which costs more than $600 a month, is about to run out. His anger at Montfort, his feelings of betrayal, are of truly biblical proportions. They used me to the point where I had no body parts left to give, Kenny said, struggling to maintain his composure. Then they just tossed me into the trash can. Once strong and powerfully built, he now walks with difficulty, tires easily, and feels useless, as though his life were over. He is 45 years old.